Hello, I'm Jaie Laplante, Artistic Director of Doc NYC, and welcome to Doc NYC's Spring Showcase presentation of The Volcano, Rescue from Whakaari. I'm joined today by our film team, which includes Rory Kennedy, Director-Producer, Mark Bailey, Writer-Producer, and Dallas Brennan Rexer, Writer-Producer. Special thanks to Netflix for making this conversation possible. So first of all, welcome to all of you, and thanks for joining us. I wanted
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I wanted to start off, but this is such an extraordinary film. My heart was in my throat the entire time. And I think the biggest surprise I had is that I had never heard of the story before. I've heard like these major stories like the Chilean miners, being trapped in a cave, or the Thai soccer, but I'd never heard of the story. And I'm so grateful that you made this film. How did you find this story, and what made you decide to elevate it in this by telling this story in film?
Yeah, well, the truth is you weren't alone in not knowing about this story. And I think part of our interest in telling the story was the fact that we hadn't heard about it either. When we read the article by Alex Perry in Outside Magazine, where he documented what happened, we were brought this story by Appian Way and Imagine Films. And they had the rights to this article and asked us if we would be interested in turning it into a documentary. And I think part of our interest in doing so was not only because it was such a dramatic and compelling story and, so heartbreaking as well, but was the fact that we hadn't heard about this either, despite the fact that 22 people had died during this harrowing event. And it was quite dramatic, and there was so much loss, but then there was also these extraordinary stories of survival, people who are on this very remote island, and having no support services. They were just too far away. And they really had to look after each other and fend for themselves. So we were happy to be able to share their story with people around the world and make people aware of what they went through.
The other thing that struck me immediately in seeing the film was, the trauma that both the survivors and the relatives of those who passed away, went through, and had to relive, in a sense, to talk to you about their experiences. Can you talk to me about how you approached working with these participants, when they've gone through that level of trauma? And right from the beginning, we see the title card of, explaining that this is a very traumatic film that we're going to be experiencing.
Yeah, it was a long process to make this film, and in many ways it needed to be. We were lucky to have the support of Netflix that gave us the long runway to build the trust and the relationships that eventually you see on the screen. And I think there was a lot of trauma, and people had to process it in their own ways. There were many people who gave it a lot of thought, and we had a lot of conversations. We shared films we'd done before. We had a lot of off the record conversations so they could understand who we were and where we were coming from. And we knew that we were asking for a lot of trust. So it was a relationship that we built, but ultimately it was incredibly rewarding. Rory and I had the fantastic experience last December, actually, along with Netflix, of going back to Whakatane, to the town where the incident was sort of the epicenter of the incident, and sharing the film with the community there. And it was such a warm and amazingly enthusiastic response. This was a trauma that the whole community had lived through, but this felt like part of their healing process to them. And people came up to us from everywhere we went, just saying that they weren't sure who we were initially, these outsiders coming from America to tell this story, but they were so thankful and relieved, and felt respected by the way the film was put together. So that was perhaps the most rewarding part of all of this.
That's wonderful. Can you elaborate on the reactions that you got? Like what did people see? Or how did people give feedback from that screening? I'm very curious.
Well, there were a range of people who came to the screening. It was very much a community screening. We didn't invite press or, the larger community. It was really inviting people who had been directly impacted by this event. It was enormously intimate and very powerful. In some cases, it was family members who were there who really, who saw what happened to their family who didn't survive. And it was very emotional, as you can imagine. In other cases, one of the interesting things that many people said is, because there were so many different perspectives and experiences, and there was so much trauma in what they went through, there wasn't necessarily awareness about what other people were going through. And so I think for many of them to also see what other people experienced while they had their own journey was enormously helpful in understanding kind of the big picture of what happened. And then, I think for others, it's an enormously traumatic experience, but I think for the people who went through it and survived, I think that the film really celebrates their ability to have gotten through this. And it was quite affirming in that way. And I think, it was very rewarding when the film came out on Netflix, and it was during the holiday week, and we didn't know how much people would become aware of it, because there was so much going on during that time with other films and other events in the media, but it ended up becoming the #1 film in the world during the holiday week on Netflix. And I think that was also really just a very affirming experience for many of the people in the film, and we were interacting with them during that time, and they were being reached out to by people they hadn't heard from in years, and people all around the world, and they were seeing all the social media, and everybody was saying such nice things about them. And for us, I feel like it was like, okay, these people who went through such a harrowing event, their stories have been heard, like they've been heard, and it was very rewarding for us.
Yeah, that was amazing. I mean, and just so everyone knows, it's really rare for a documentary to be the #1 film on Netflix worldwide. So, testament to the power of the story and also the power of the filmmaking, which is what I want to ask about next, like the construction of the film. So there's obviously some material you got from cell phone footages, but how much did you involve other aspects, like in terms of, were you allowed to go back to the island just to shoot the overhead shots, or like what kind of, I mean, this is just you capture the beauty of nature and of the wild experience there so well. Could you just talk about how the film was constructed?
I can talk a little bit about the production, and maybe Mark wants to talk about some of the editing and the story structure we went with. But for production, we were not allowed to step foot on the island again, but we did feel that the volcano became a character. Obviously, it became the organizing principle around which everybody's lives connected. And so it was important for us to both see it with our own eyes, to just understand it, but then also to capture it in a variety of ways filmically. And we were able to go back in a few ways. We flew over and we did some amazing aerial shots, but we were flying with the original pilots who were there. So it was Rory was in the helicopter with Tim Barrow, and then we had John Fennell flying around. It was kind of it was a moment for them to go back and retrace their steps, and also for us to see them in contrast with the volcano in its current state. And then we went back by boat and filmed with drones and filmed from the boats, and we're there with Mark Inman at the time also, who was going back to pay tribute to his brother. So it was both a filming trip and a personal emotional trip. And then we had a lot of fantastic footage from a variety of sources. We had footage from the day, some of which had never been seen before, some of which even the people who recorded it had not seen it before. They found it too difficult to go back and review, but they shared it with us, with the trust that we would do something meaningful with it. And then we worked with a great design team to kind of create the feeling of being on the island using footage and graphic elements that we felt were evocative of the moment without sort of sensationalizing it. So that was another element to it. Maybe Mark wants to talk some more about the story structure.
Well, I mean, the story structure was pretty straightforward. I think the key kind of decision was to really stay on the ground and kind of in a minute by minute unfolding way, and to keep the point of view to the people who experienced that. So if Brian DePaul is talking about being on the boat coming back, he was there, and or Jeff Hoffman. And so I think that and once we had that, we kind of moved through it in I think a classically kind of linear way, but just sort of keeping the tension and trying to keep the audience connected to what the subjects were experiencing in that moment. And the archive that Dallas is talking about, whether it was archive actually from that day or other footage that we had taken, or stuff that I would hesitate to call it a recreation, but that sort of set up for certain moments that were incredibly intense, and that we didn't want it to create any confusion as to whether this was real footage or not. We kind of used a very stylized these patches of time that were more kind of I guess emotional and mood. And so yeah, so that was and so it's a pretty confined time frame. And then at the end of the film, we sort of had a jump to kind of where folks were now, and that was sort of
Got it. Thank you. So my next question is about the impact of the not only the film but the event. So part of the attraction of this attraction was the sort of thrill-seeking nature. Like, you get to go close to a live active volcano, but yet we see that had tragic consequences. And has there been any impact that the film has had on other similar type of volcano adventures around the world that you may be aware of, or that have you heard about any of these type of things having been impacted by the actual event?
I can take some of this. I don't know about other volcanoes around the world, but I know that this community felt the impact very directly of having the island closed. Island's still closed today. You can't step foot back on it. And I think there are a lot of financial implications for a tourist-based town. It also happened right before COVID shut everything down, so it was sort of a double whammy for a lot of the people who had a tourist-based industry in that part of New Zealand. But I think it also forced New Zealand to reckon with its adventure tourism industry in a more general sense, with something that's still ongoing there. There's an ongoing legal battle about the settlement with the people who were injured on the island, and about how to handle the tourist industries that were catering to bringing people out there. But I think it's raising a lot of questions that are still unanswered for adventure tourism in general, and how much risk is tolerable and how much isn't.
Yeah, very interesting discussion. So tell me more about filming in New Zealand. You mentioned that at first you felt a little bit of apprehension from the people that you were coming to tell their story. What other how did you overcome that, and what kind of surprises did you find from working with the people of New Zealand?
I think one of the things that many of the people said to us was, I even though many of us weren't aware of what happened, it was an event that drew international press at the time. And, a lot of what we heard from people who were impacted is that the media kind of swept in and they would want to tell the story in a certain way, and they would take sound bites from people, and then they would kind of leave, and they were left feeling a little bit exposed. And so I think the experience with the press had been a negative one largely for many of the people. So we had to kind of overcome that and help people understand that we were there to really try to get the story right, to be there for the long haul, and to spend time on the ground with folks. And, as Dallas pointed out, not only once the film was done, the first place that we went to share the film was with the people who were most directly impacted, before it was launched into the world on Netflix. And so, building those relationships took some time, but I think people did ultimately come around, and clearly they opened up their doors to us and were willing to let us tell their stories. I would say another challenge during this particular period of time was COVID. It was really during the heart of COVID, and New Zealand was one of the most shut down countries in the world. Not only could you not get in and out of New Zealand, you couldn't get in and out of your own house, or your town, so it was quite challenging to, find the windows that, like, as soon as it would open up, we would get there, and then it would close down again. We'd have to leave. So it was dealing with those challenges. So some of the interviews you see were done remotely, others were done in person if we were able to get there. But New Zealand is a beautiful country, and it's wonderful people, and we were always happy to be there, and experience and you really, when you're there, appreciate, this is a country that has dozens and dozens of active volcanoes. It feels very alive, right? There's a ski mountain on the South Island that is an active volcano that has people skiing on it and chairlifts, and they continue to go up and down that mountain even despite White Island. So I think that despite these events, and of course White Island, people have been going there for many decades, and nothing like this had happened. It was really 100 years since there had been a significant event when people were on the island, and it was of course a roll of the dice. But I don't know that the message has completely penetrated that, okay, well, as a result of this, we're going to close down all high risk adventure travel in New Zealand. It's very much part of their culture and their identity, and kind of how people go through the world there.
Another thing that struck me was, the sense of the matter-of-factness of the people who were involved in the rescue. It seems so instinctual, like that they just sort of kicked into gear, to rush in and help, which is a very human thing, of course. But in New Zealand, the New Zealanders that are on screen, they just felt very, in a sense, more humble than I expected, even in the recounting of that. Did you find a similar sensation in terms of heroism or any of those kind of attributes?
They're very self-effacing. They're like, oh my gosh, they're so sort of understated and kind of naturally averse to being pushed into the sort of role of hero. You guys can speak more to that, but I agree. They just were so matter of fact about what were really, in fact, extraordinarily courageous, actions. You're kind of wowed by it.
Yeah, Mark Law, and for one, who flew the helicopter. He's this incredibly imposing, heroic guy. First of all, he hates the word hero, and anytime we used it, he would grimace. But we actually had to interview him twice, because the first one he was so nonchalant about what he did that he just kept brushing it over, and yeah, I did what I had to do. I did what anybody would have done. And keep wanting to say, well, I'm not sure anybody would have jumped into their helicopter and flown into an erupting volcano to rescue strangers. That's maybe you're giving people a little too much credit. But yeah, there's a hardiness that they all have that's great. And I'm from Maine, and they kind of similar type of personality. You know, they're kind of just like, we'll get it done. We'll do what we have to do to get people taken care of, and not wait around for anybody to give us any clap on the back.
Have you remained in contact with the the people in the film since that premiere in December, and also the people from other parts of the world?
Yes, very much so. Actually, 3 of my nieces just spent a number of days with one of the helicopter pilots, Tim Barrow, and he took them, unbeknownst to me, to the top of a volcano. And I said, "Did any of you guys watch our film? Did you learn the lesson of the film? Don't go to a volcano in New Zealand." Anyway, it wasn't an active volcano, but it's still. But we're very much in touch with them. Mark Law, the helicopter pilot, has come here and visited us, and we were in text communication. And then Jesse, who of course tragically lost his parents and his sister during the volcano. We have a text exchange, and keep in touch with him, as well as many of the other folks.
And what kind of, I think one of the most impressive things for me is just the beauty, the awful beauty of nature sometimes. It's so beautiful, yet it can be a killer. How did this film kind of fit into what we're talking about, what we're talking about collectively in terms of the environment and our relationships, as humans with the nature around us? How did you frame that when you were making the film?
Well, I think that for us, there's been so many climate events of late where people are surviving, hurricanes and fires. We ourselves, my husband and I, Mark is my husband, survived the Woolsey fire. We had to leave our house in an emergency evacuation, and it was quite frightening to try to get out of here with this big plume of smoke and fire chasing us down the highway. And I think that, even though a volcano eruption isn't a climate related event, that there was an opportunity to help people understand what happens in the aftermath and like the immediate aftermath of these events, and tell this story from the ground of what happens when, these kind of dramatic moments that are in nature kind of take over our lives in such an unexpected way, and that there was insight into that. And I think what we landed on was this idea that in situations like this, you hope that institutions and governments and all the rest step up, but often when unexpected events happen in nature, you really only have the people around you. And ultimately that kind of affirmation of people showing up for each other and risking their lives for each other and for strangers, is something that we found to be quite affirming in the face of this very tragic event.
And one last question before we wrap up. You had mentioned that the people around Whakaari were, they had relied a lot on tourism. Have they been able to adapt? I mean, New Zealand, the North Island, is still a very beautiful place, and the images that we saw are so beautiful. Have they been able to replace that, or, with a kind of normal flow of tourism, or how is the town surviving?
I think it's been very slow. I think they're slowly, coming back and rebuilding, but it also, I think, was a moment of reckoning about whether or not they want to be a tourism-based economy and what that means. There was a large part of the story was also about the role that Maori traditions and cultures and history play in this region and understanding nature. And that is a subtext that's very strong in the community and very important in this area. And going back to your earlier question about kind of understanding nature, I think one of the things I really enjoyed learning in the process of making this film was gaining a more robust understanding of nature as seen in the Maori tradition, which is this living, breathing, organic being that you share space with, and you have to negotiate that space, and you have to be respectful, and then you also have to understand that you are small in comparison. And so there's a really fascinating mindset that is just sort of imbued in the culture, and particularly in the North Island, that I think hopefully comes out in pieces in the film.
Yeah, so I do wanted to just delve into that a little bit more deeply. So the Maori traditions that you're talking about, how were you able to appreciate that, or was that an extra layer, beyond the townspeople, getting into the Aboriginal culture?
Yeah, we spent time with a number of members of Ngāti which is the local Maui iwi from the area. That certainly Bunny, who lost her grandson, was sort of reckoning with her love of nature and respect of nature as the place where she felt her ancestors came from, and yet it's took her grandson away. And so she had a lot of soul searching that she was doing. And there was, I think that the community really came together at the marae, at the sort of meeting place for Maori culture. And there was a lot of there were a lot of healing ceremonies and even just morning meetings that I think were really restorative for people even who had no connection to the culture or different types of beliefs. And so so it was important for us to meet all of the elders and to talk to them and to get their blessings as we made this project. And when we went back to share with the community, it was a really beautiful ceremony where we were welcomed by the elders in Tereo, in their language, and then there were actually, it was a meeting of several different elders who welcomed us in and kind of gave their blessings to the film to tell their story, which was very meaningful.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for this great film, and thank you for joining us to talk about it, and for all of your insights. Rory, Dallas, Mark, thank you again. Thank you to Netflix. That's a wrap.